June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Maxia, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly as Unoffizier Werner Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, recording words that would have earned him solitary confinement if discovered by his own officers. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the train window, he had just witnessed something that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window. The night sky, normally dark in Germany under blackout regulations, was instead stitched with a lattice of illumination that stretched across the Texas plains like veins of molten gold. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification reached barely 20% of German farms. Here, however, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsing America, electricity flowed like water. Streetlights glimmered along unbroken highways. Farmhouses glowed warmly in the distance. Neon signs flickered over shop fronts, advertising goods and services the prisoners had only ever imagined in propaganda leaflets. The sight was not just a shock to the eyes, it was a shock to the mind.
1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped down from the passenger train. Not cattle cars, not freight wagons, but cushioned Pullman coaches with dining services and sleeping berths. Uniforms dusted with desert sand, sunburned faces and calloused hands, they looked around as if arriving on an alien planet. The entire population of Maxia had turned out to witness their arrival. Children craned their necks to see the strange men. Women carried baskets of bread and pie. Men tipped hats politely. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological transformation in modern prisoner history. A systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through the sheer display of American industrial capacity. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans, but in production statistics, logistics, and infrastructure that would soon shatter every assumption these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse had begun on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as scattered units continued surrendering over several days. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, were suddenly prisoners. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Rodke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers.
Even before boarding the transport ships at Oran, Algeria, the prisoners noticed that the Americans moved with a precision and efficiency that defied their expectations. Thousands of POWs were processed daily with flawless order, photographed, cataloged, medically examined, inoculated, and briefed on their rights under the Geneva Convention. German officers who had once commanded battalions now watched in silent awe as their captors handled administrative tasks with a calm and competence they had never encountered. Each small step, the stamping of papers, the filing of identification cards, the careful explanation of rights in perfect German, was a lesson in organizational superiority. The first real shock came in the form of food. Oberreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote to his mother, "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, fresh meat, vegetables, coffee. We thought it was propaganda, an attempt to impress us. We did not understand this was standard. For men who had endured weeks on sparse rations and dried biscuits, the abundance seemed incomprehensible. Plates piled high, bread still warm, cups of coffee steaming. It was a demonstration of power in its simplest, most tangible form. Nourishment without scarcity." Boarding the Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic offered yet another revelation. These vessels, monuments to American industrial might, had been produced with a speed and scale the Germans could hardly comprehend. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Each ship, with a capacity to carry thousands of prisoners or cargo, embodied the logistical superiority of the United States. Soldiers who had once believed the Reich unstoppable now began to realize that defeat could come not just from bullets or tanks, but from systems, numbers, and efficiency.
The Atlantic crossing further reinforced the prisoners' growing awareness of American abundance. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division recorded that the ship's crew discarded more food daily than his company had consumed in a week. Steaks, loaves of bread, gallons of milk. They threw it away without a second thought. This was not cruelty, it was normalcy. The sheer scale of resources available to the Americans, the lack of fear for scarcity, shocked and unsettled even the most hardened soldiers. As the ship approached the American coast, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian lineage was steeped in military tradition, noticed radar antennas rotating steadily above the deck. "This technology," he later wrote, "which we believed only Germany and perhaps the British possessed, was standard equipment. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." The revelation gnawed at him. Victory was no longer a matter of maneuvering tanks or clever infantry assaults. It was a question of industrial capacity, of the ability to outproduce and outsupply on a scale they could barely imagine. Arriving at Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the prisoners' disbelief deepened. The sprawling docks covered thousands of acres. Cranes lifted tons of cargo in perfect synchronization, and ships of every size and purpose docked and departed with an efficiency that dwarfed any German port. Gerhard Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr, counted 47 ships simultaneously being loaded and unloaded. Each crane moved like a mechanical giant, powered by electricity, unchoked by coal smoke, untroubled by delays. German officers muttered in disbelief, comparing these feats to the best ports in Hamburg or Kiel, only to find their memories insufficient to match the reality. The march from the docks to the waiting trains continued the unintentional lesson in prosperity. Parking lots teemed with civilian automobiles, cars owned by workers, not the elite. Shops overflowed with goods. Houses were well lit, well furnished, and well stocked. Soldiers pressed their faces against the windows of towns along the route, realizing that this level of abundance was normal, not exceptional. Obergefreiter Müller, whose father had been a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, scribbled in a letter. We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. It was unimaginable. And then the trains themselves. Pullman coaches with padded seats, air conditioning, observation cars, dining cars with white tablecloths. Soldiers who had expected boxcars and cramped quarters now boarded like tourists, marveling at the luxury. Hauptmann Rodke noted the sergeant who escorted them apologized for a minor malfunction in the air conditioning, an almost comical concern in the minds of men who had endured the Sahara heat in rags. Conversations among prisoners turned from bitter complaints to whispered wonder at the scale of organization and abundance around them. As the trains rolled through Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, prisoners observed factories glowing through the night, electric signs illuminating the streets, and workers operating machinery with a smoothness they had never seen. Every factory, every well-lit city, every worker with their own automobile or lunch in hand became a lesson in American capability. Even routine operations, like the refueling of steam locomotives or the loading of cargo, were executed with precision and speed beyond their comprehension.
For the first time, the reality of American power was undeniable. It was not boasted of, not broadcast through propaganda, but present in every visible detail. The lights, the cars, the factories, the food, the infrastructure. For men who had been taught that America was decadent, weak, and incapable of organized war, the shock was profound. They were no longer prisoners merely of circumstance. They were prisoners of a truth that threatened the very ideology they had been taught to defend. Hauptmann Rodke would later write, "We crossed an ocean as soldiers of a master race. We arrived believing we could endure anything. We left knowing we had witnessed a power beyond our nation's capacity, a nation whose soldiers and citizens lived in a reality our propaganda had denied. America had conquered us before a shot was fired, not with bombs, but with abundance, organization, and the certainty of production." The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria. The prisoners had been funneled into sprawling makeshift camps, rows of tents, and hastily constructed wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Rodke, along with 30,000 other POWs, waited under the scorching Algerian sun, their uniforms dusty and their faces sunburned from desert campaigns. Here, in this temporary city of captivity, the first cracks in their preconceptions began to appear. American efficiency was already beginning to undermine everything they had been taught about their enemy. Soldiers who had once prided themselves on their meticulous adherence to orders found themselves in awe as the U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners each day with a precision that surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had achieved at the height of its power. Every step, photographing identity cards, filing records, administering medical exams, providing inoculations, was carried out with an almost bureaucratic grace. The American officers spoke fluent German, explaining Geneva Convention rights, calmly answering questions, and patiently guiding the prisoners through forms and procedures. These men had trained their entire lives to command, yet here they were, confronted with a system that made their own seem chaotic by comparison.
The first true shock, however, came not from paperwork or regulations, but from food. Oberreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would later recount to his mother the incredulity that consumed him. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, rich coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration. For men who had subsisted on dried biscuits, spoiled canned goods, and meager rations in the North African heat, this was almost physically disorienting. The food was abundant, clean, and served without calculation or hesitation, a tangible proof that the enemy they had been taught to fear was, in reality, overwhelmingly capable and prosperous. Then came the ships. The Liberty vessels that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves floating monuments to American industrial might. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in a mere 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, a feat so astonishing that had the Germans known it at the time, they would have dismissed it as impossible propaganda. At the height of production, these ships were being launched at a rate of 3 per day, and now they returned from delivering war materiel to the European theater filled with human cargo instead of supplies. By the summer of 1943, up to 30,000 POWs were transported each month across the Atlantic, a testament to both logistical efficiency and the scale of American manufacturing.
The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 became a second, more subtle phase of psychological shock. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a meticulous record of daily events, notes that survived and letters sent home after his repatriation. He observed that the ship's crew discarded more food in a single day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during their last months in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, and gallons of milk left untouched were thrown overboard or into bins, openly, without a hint of malice or theatricality. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock us, but because to them, this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless, Zimmermann wrote. The enormity of American resources, so unlike the carefully rationed, scarcity-driven life they had endured, was a lesson that no propaganda could convey. Beyond the food, the ships themselves became floating classrooms in industrial power. POWs learned that the vessel carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war, each requiring 250,000 individual parts assembled from components manufactured across 32 different states. Engines were constructed in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders, then shipped to ports that had barely existed 2 years prior and assembled into functioning ships. Talkative American guards, sensing the curiosity and awe of the prisoners, explained the process with a casual pride that left the Germans stunned. This was production on a scale and speed that even the most optimistic German planners could scarcely imagine.
Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stoberen, whose aristocratic Prussian lineage traced service through every German war since Frederick the Great, was among those whose perception of the war shifted irrevocably on that voyage. As the ship approached the American coast, he watched the radar antenna rotating steadily above the bridge. This technology, he wrote years later in his memoirs, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. The realization gnawed at him.
Victory would no longer be determined solely by battlefield skill, bravery, or the ingenuity of officers. It would be determined by the scale of production, the capacity to mobilize a nation's resources, and the ability to sustain logistics on a massive, continuous scale. For days, the prisoners absorbed the sheer scale of the operation around them. Every crew member had a role, every machine a purpose. Even routine maintenance was executed with efficiency that would have seemed superhuman back home. In the crowded holds where POWs slept on cots, whispered conversations ranged from incredulous wonder to despairing comparisons. Men who had survived Africa and France whispered to one another about the futility of continuing a war against a nation capable of producing not one, but thousands of ships, planes, and supplies with such relentless regularity. Each day of the crossing reinforced the same lesson. America was not merely strong, it was unstoppable. Not because of its soldiers, but because of its organization, resources, and industrial ingenuity.
By the time they sighted the coast of Virginia, the prisoners' understanding of the war had already shifted. They had not been struck by artillery or outmaneuvered in battle. They had been confronted by an entirely different kind of power, a quiet, overwhelming, almost invisible force. The capability to feed, house, transport, and equip tens of thousands with a consistency and abundance that made the German war machine look brittle and small. The crossing was not just a journey across the Atlantic, it was a journey across the threshold of belief, from certainty in their own nation's supremacy to a dawning recognition of the scale of the challenge they truly faced. August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching like steel arteries into the Chesapeake. Cranes rising like sentinels against the sky, each one methodically loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. The rhythmic clanging of metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the roar of engines, and the shuffle of workers created a symphony of organized power that the prisoners had never imagined. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. A revelation that left many staring with open mouths and hands pressed against their diaries in disbelief.
Gerhard Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in careful detail in his secret diary, lifted massive containers that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany, moving them with electric precision, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked the industrial cities back home. The scale was incomprehensible. Endless stacks of steel, crates of food, barrels of fuel, and machinery being maneuvered with effortless coordination. Every detail suggested a nation operating not at the limits of its resources, but as though resources were infinite. As the columns of prisoners were formed for the march to the waiting trains, the POWs were given more sights that contradicted everything they had been told. Along the route, parking lots stretched like small fields, filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers, men who drove to their labor and returned to homes that radiated comfort and light. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege reserved for the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen,
promised to the people since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 vehicles to civilians by 1943. Here, in Norfolk, ordinary men drove to work in their own cars, casual and unconcerned, as if wealth and industrial might were simply ordinary facts of life. The prisoners whispered to one another, disbelief evident in every glance. "This cannot be real," muttered one gift writer. "We have been lied to every day of the war."
But nothing, not even the vast docks or the endless automobiles, had prepared them for the trains themselves. They did not enter boxcars, nor the infamous 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses cramped together for long journeys across Europe, but full Pullman coaches, padded seats converting to sleeping berths, dining cars adorned with white tablecloths and polished silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows designed for comfort and view. Hauptmann Rodke, his eyes wide and his hand trembling over his diary, wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The air was cool, regulated and clean, scented faintly of polish and fresh linens. The guards, recognizing the contrast to the prisoners' expectations, seemed almost embarrassed by the level of comfort they were providing. One sergeant even apologized, with a shy smile, that the air conditioning in their car wasn't working properly. Rodke could hardly contain his astonishment. "Air conditioning," he wrote, "in August. We had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train, reserved for the Reich's elite. Here, it was routine, standard, given to common prisoners." Each man in the column pressed closer to the windows, observing small but astonishing details. Magazines neatly stacked in racks, fresh water in taps, polished brass handles, and uniformed attendants checking on the passengers with polite smiles. It was a world of meticulous comfort, entirely unlike the harsh, barren journeys the Wehrmacht had endured across Europe and Africa.
The psychological impact of these first hours aboard the train was profound. Men who had prided themselves on endurance, toughness, and the supposed superiority of German military discipline now faced an entirely different standard of organization and abundance. Even simple gestures, the polite inquiries of guards, the soft murmur of conversation, the abundance of light and air, contradicted the propaganda that had taught them that Americans were weak, decadent, and incapable of managing a modern war. Every detail, from the smooth operation of the train itself to the casual wealth of the civilians they glimpsed along the way, chipped away at their assumptions, leaving the prisoners in a fragile, uncertain state of awe and disbelief. As the train pulled slowly out of Norfolk, the POWs pressed their faces to the glass, watching cranes continue their relentless work, cargo being sorted with a precision they could barely comprehend, and workers walking past in crisp uniforms, drinking soda from glass bottles, eating sandwiches packed with meat, cheese, and vegetables, a luxury most of them had not seen in years. Each mile reinforced the same lesson. America was not merely strong, it was organized, abundant, and technologically advanced to a degree that rendered the German industrial effort pale in comparison. The journey had begun, and with each passing hour, the ideological walls constructed by years of Nazi indoctrination began to crumble.
The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma proved to be more destructive to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat could ever have been. As the trains rolled steadily through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, eyes wide, hearts racing, trying to process a reality that seemed physically impossible. Every town, every village, every small cluster of homes defied everything they had been taught. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, names that had meant nothing before, now became symbols of incomprehensible abundance. In Germany, even the largest cities had suffered from relentless blackouts, with homes and streets plunged into darkness by decree. Yet here, every shop window gleamed with light, electric signs blazed in brilliant colors, and houses burned brightly in multiple rooms, their occupants going about their evening routines as if there were no war at all. Factories worked night shifts, windows glowing, chimneys puffing minimal smoke, while parking lots overflowed with cars even at midnight, as if labor itself had become a celebration of productivity. Obergefreiter Wöhler, whose father had been a loyal Nazi Party bloc leader in Hamburg, recorded in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. We could not stop staring. I called the guard a liar when he told us it was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. He only shrugged and said we would see. I never imagined such a world could exist." His handwriting shook on the page, a mixture of awe and the slow dawning of despair.
In Roanoke, Virginia, the train paused for water and coal, providing yet another shock. Prisoners watched American railway workers perform in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours or more in Germany. Automated coal loaders lifted tons of fuel with mechanical precision. Electric water pumps gushed into storage tanks, and mechanized lubrication systems quietly maintained engines without human strain. The men observed every detail with disbelief, from the synchronized efficiency to the absence of shouting, exhaustion, and disorder. Even more disorienting was the casual affluence of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages, draped in uniforms, clean and sturdy. They sipped Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossing the empties without concern into bins. Cigarettes were smoked constantly, stubbed out carelessly, as if tobacco were as plentiful as air. Each gesture reinforced the same disquieting realization. America's resources were endless, its people unburdened by scarcity, and its work powered by ingenuity rather than brute force.
Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer who had worked at Siemens before the war, took careful note of the energy consumption around them. Calculating in his head as the train idled, he realized that the single railway yard they had stopped at consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a full day. He wrote later, "The waste was magnificent. They left lights burning in empty buildings, electric fans running in vacant rooms, heaters operating in silent offices. This was not carelessness. This was the casual expression of infinite resources. A nation unconcerned with scarcity, a society that could squander power because power itself was abundant." As the trains crossed the borders into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners were confronted with American industrial power at its fullest, most unrestrained expression.
Factories stretched endlessly along rivers and railways, each larger and more complex than any they had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee alone ran 3 miles along the riverbank, its massive electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich, a city they had once considered a symbol of German efficiency and pride. The prisoners stared in stunned silence at the rows of glowing windows, the rhythm of molten metal being poured, the hum of machines that seemed to move in perfect synchrony, as if the very air vibrated with industrial might. Each man in the column felt the slow, crushing realization that their homeland, their carefully constructed beliefs about superiority, and the promises of the Reich were being systematically dismantled, frame by frame, window by window, factory by factory.
The journey was no longer just a physical transport. It was a mental crucible, exposing the prisoners to sights that undermined propaganda and planted seeds of doubt, curiosity, and awe. The nights were illuminated not only by American electricity, but by a dawning awareness. They had crossed an ocean as warriors of the master race and were now witnesses to a society whose material and technological power exceeded anything they had been trained to fear, admire, or understand. Near Louisville, the trains slowed as they passed the sprawling Rubber Town complex, a marvel of industrial speed and scale that seemed almost alien to the prisoners. What had once been open fields 18 months prior now held 4 massive synthetic rubber facilities, each a labyrinth of distillation towers, catalytic crackers, and interconnecting pipelines that hummed with relentless activity. Thousands of workers moved like clockwork, the synchronized dance of labor and machine, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, a figure that left even the most seasoned German chemists speechless. Germany, despite inventing the process decades earlier, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberlieutenant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist formerly employed by I.G. Farben, pressed his face to the window, eyes wide. He could recognize the machinery, the layout, the technical innovations. In a post-war interview, he would recall, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers, the compressors. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built. And there were 4 of them just in this one location. And the guard whispered that there were dozens more across the country. Dozens!" The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. Germany had been outproduced, outthought, and outbuilt, while soldiers were dying in the desert, and no propaganda could prepare him for the scale of what he was witnessing.
As the train barreled on, the prisoners caught sight of Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away like an industrial cathedral. This single factory, erected in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Each aircraft assembled from 1,550,000 parts, sourced from 1,500 subcontractors across the nation. 42,000 workers labored in a symphony of precision and speed. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. The sheer audacity of the endeavor left many POWs slack-jawed. Every conveyor, jig, and assembly line screamed of coordination, planning, and capital beyond comprehension. Hauptmann Verlee, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, leaned against the glass, counting 17 B-24s in various stages of completion visible from the train. He wrote in his journal, "We had been told that American planes were inferior, hastily built, and would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible, faster than the entire Luftwaffe could produce in months." His hands shook as he sketched the layout on the back of a scrap of paper, desperate to commit it to memory. Each bomb bay, each wing assembly, each worker operating machinery with quiet confidence struck him with a slow, accumulating terror. The enemy was limitless in both manpower and ingenuity.
The deeper the trains penetrated into the American heartland, the more complete the demolition of Nazi mythology became. In St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, its steel structure dwarfed by the river itself, while below, barges carried more grain than the entirety of Germany's 1942 harvest. Grain elevators lined both banks, towering, immense, each holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a Bavarian farmer's son, scribbled feverishly in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities, without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. And the crane operator? He was eating a sandwich, meat, thicker than our weekly ration for 3 men. He barely looked at the cargo. The sheer nonchalance made my stomach turn." In Kansas City, the train slowed again, stopping at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle were penned for slaughter. The smell of the meatpacking plants wafted miles, thick and pungent, an assault to noses unaccustomed to abundance. The German POWs, who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa when they were lucky, watched in disbelief as American workers bit into beef sandwiches, wiping their hands on overalls, chatting casually, as if eating meat were as ordinary as breathing. Gefreiter Paul Fischer wrote in his notebook, "They ate meat like we ate bread. No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we dreamed we could eat bread, and they did not even count it. It was not a privilege or reward. This was normal. This was daily life. And when our guard bought us hamburgers from a nearby stand, paying for 20 of them with a single dollar, I realized that even this luxury was simply mundane here. Chocolate, bread, meat, abundance was routine."
The train moved on, carrying soldiers from a vanquished empire through a land that seemed impossible, a country whose wealth, technology, and production capabilities made years of Nazi indoctrination collapse under the simplest observation. Every town, every factory, every field stretched before them like a litmus test of reality, proving one unassailable truth: Germany, no matter the propaganda, could not match this. The cumulative weight of sight, smell, and measurement pressed down on the prisoners,
reshaping their understanding of war, power, and the limits of human achievement. The arrival at the camps themselves marked yet another stage in the systematic demolition of Nazi ideology. Camp Hearn, Texas, constructed in an astonishing 4 months, sprawled across the landscape like a small, orderly town. It housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that many of them had never imagined, even for civilians. Long wooden barracks lined neat streets, each equipped with electric lights that illuminated every corner. Flush toilets that worked without complaint, hot showers with running water, and steam heat that banished the chill of early mornings. Each building had been erected with more lumber than entire German villages possessed, a fact not lost on the prisoners as they walked past walls that seemed impossibly solid and orderly. They had been told that America was decadent, weak, and rationed, yet here was proof of an industriousness and scale that shattered every preconception.
The camp hospital became a cathedral of modern medicine to the medical officers among the prisoners. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, paused at the entrance, mouth slightly agape as he took in the rows of equipment and bustling staff. X-ray machines gleamed under fluorescent lights. Surgical instruments were meticulously arranged. Pharmaceuticals that had been unobtainable in Germany since 1941 were stacked on shelves in abundance. Penicillin, the legendary miracle drug, was administered without hesitation, even for minor infections. Dr. Bauer would later testify, "We had only heard rumors of such medicine. In Germany, soldiers were dying for want of sulfa drugs, and yet here the Americans gave freely. There was no calculation, no rationing. They treated us like human beings, not captives, not inferiors." The scale of provision alone was enough to overturn any notion of our supposed superiority. The meticulous organization of supplies, the cleanliness of the wards, and the calm efficiency of the nurses, all standard procedure, felt like a direct challenge to every assumption about civilization that the Wehrmacht had held. The camp kitchen, meanwhile, became an unexpected classroom in American abundance and efficiency. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties encountered machinery and facilities that seemed fantastical by German wartime standards. Walk-in refrigerators humming with cold air, electric mixers kneading dough for hundreds at a time, automated dishwashers cleaning utensils faster than a team of trained hands could, and enormous gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men simultaneously. Every ingredient, every portion was fresh. Milk, eggs, vegetables, meat, white bread, items that German civilians had not seen in quantity since 1939, lined the counters. The scale alone was bewildering.
Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, kept a meticulous diary of the day-to-day operations. One morning, he recorded in trembling handwriting, "Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The regulations dictate that we prepare 10% more than is needed to guarantee every prisoner receives full rations. What is left is discarded. I wept as I lifted baskets of perfectly good bread, fresh meat, and vegetables into the garbage bins. My hands shook. I could not comprehend it. In Germany, we rationed every scrap of flour, every egg, every scrap of meat. Here, surplus is a matter of course. The Americans do not hoard. They do not calculate scarcity. They simply provide abundantly and without thought. Even the act of serving the food became a revelation. Rows of prisoners lined up, trays in hand, while cooks moved efficiently, layering plates with precision and generosity. The clatter of utensils, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread, the warmth of the kitchen. It was a sensory assault on years of indoctrination, a living argument that their enemy's society was organized, wealthy, and fundamentally different from the impoverished, starving image painted by Nazi propaganda. Every day spent in the kitchen, every tray of food handled, every discarded loaf, reinforced the growing cognitive dissonance. The soldiers began to internalize the impossibility. Germany could not win, could not even approach this level of production, generosity, or organization.
By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture, caused by millions of men serving overseas, had reached a critical point. The U.S. government, driven by necessity, turned to an unexpected source: captured German soldiers. The decision to employ POWs in fields, factories, and processing plants across the country would have consequences far beyond labor relief. For the prisoners, it became a living education, a daily confrontation with a society and an economy that utterly defied everything they had been told in Nazi propaganda. Each day, groups of men were loaded onto trucks and transported to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds, without restricted routes, without the constant fear of mistreatment. They saw the landscape, the towns, and the infrastructure. They saw the endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon like seas of gold and green. They watched factories running 3 full shifts, their lights burning late into the night, smokestacks quiet, machinery humming with electric power. They passed shops stocked with goods, counters overflowing, and parking lots filled with automobiles, ordinary people driving ordinary cars. They glimpsed houses with refrigerators humming quietly in the kitchens, radios broadcasting news and music, and families living in comfort that would have been unimaginable back home.
At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang observed the full scale of industrialized agriculture for the first time. A single machine, massive and humming with electric motors, processed more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods of hand-picking and rudimentary pulleys. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943, an achievement that would have seemed impossible to any German who had only known the darkness of their rural homeland. Lang's diary entry reflected a mixture of disbelief and awe. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, not aristocracy, not a party member, not a general. Just a man living his life, yet he possessed electricity, running water, a truck, a car, a tractor. His workers, including Negro laborers, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers had received in a week, and this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. Every farm had power, machinery, and efficiency beyond our imagining. Every field had a tractor. Every barn had electric lighting. Every silo had conveyor systems.
The prisoners watched how the crops were irrigated and harvested with mechanized precision, how water pumps and electric motors worked seamlessly to keep fields productive. They saw farmhands, young and old, men and women, working in teams with tractors, cotton pickers, and threshers. Each piece of equipment powered by electricity, each task accelerated 100-fold compared to German methods. The sheer scale of production was overwhelming, but it was the casual normality of it all that struck hardest. Here, wealth and industrial capability were not monopolized by the elite or the state. They were ordinary, mundane, woven into everyday life. Workers ate hearty lunches in the shade of silos, drank iced water from taps that ran freely, and returned to the fields with no fear of scarcity. Lang could not shake the image of a single farm, producing in one season enough cotton to supply dozens of villages back home. He wrote, "We had been trained to believe America was decadent, collapsing, starving. Every machine, every field, every worker we saw told a different story. The war had not crippled them, it had organized them. They were efficient, wealthy, and limitless in resourcefulness." As the trucks rolled from one farm to another, the cumulative effect of this exposure took hold in the minds of the prisoners. They discussed what they saw in quiet whispers, in German among themselves. One remarked on the speed of tractors compared to horses. Another marveled at the abundance of food for workers and animals alike. The more they witnessed, the more impossible it became to reconcile their Nazi training with reality. The propaganda that had painted Americans as weak, decadent, and incapable was falling apart piece by piece. The fields, the machines, the houses, the trucks, the electric lights, all were evidence of a society operating on a level of wealth, power, and efficiency that Germany could not hope to match. In Nebraska, the prisoners were assigned to work in vast sugar beet fields, and the scale of American agriculture left them staggered. The machinery alone was enough to break their preconceptions. A single combine harvester, gleaming with polished metal and humming with electric power, could accomplish the work of 100 men in the same time. Rows upon rows of crops stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon, far larger than entire German counties. The prisoners, who had labored for weeks with hand tools and small tractors in Europe, could hardly comprehend such efficiency. Farmers moved through the fields with casual confidence, speaking of yields that would have seemed miraculous back home. 60 bushels of wheat per acre, one explained, and that's not even exceptional. In Germany, even the best land rarely produced more than 30 bushels per acre.
Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, assigned to a farm outside Scottsbluff, Nebraska, kept a meticulous diary. He noted the incredible wealth of machinery and the nonchalance of its operators. The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime, he wrote. When Hoffmann commented on the tractor's value, the boy laughed heartily and shrugged. "It's nothing," he said. "This isn't even a particularly good model. My father is waiting for the new John Deere coming next month. It'll be even better." The casual abundance, the complete normalization of technological superiority left the German soldiers dumbfounded. Machines that could perform 100-fold the work of men, engines that ran continuously without pause, and fields that stretched beyond comprehension, they were confronted by the physical evidence that
American prosperity was not an illusion. The most profound revelations, however, awaited those prisoners who were assigned to factories or industrial facilities. Geneva Convention rules strictly prohibited direct involvement in war production, but the Americans had found a legal loophole. Prisoners could work in industries that freed skilled American workers for military production. This meant that thousands of German soldiers, while technically unarmed and non-combatant, could observe the inner workings of American industry at its height. They saw with their own eyes the scale, efficiency, and precision that had been invisible from the outside.
At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, POWs witnessed production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than entire German food factories managed in a month. The workforce was skeletal, mostly elderly men and women, as younger men were fighting overseas, but the output was staggering. Every step was mechanized: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, massive steam cookers capable of processing hundreds of cans simultaneously. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had previously overseen a medium-sized German food processing plant, chronicled his astonishment. Everything is automated. One elderly woman monitored a control panel that would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while sipping coffee and listening to a radio. No one rushed her. The machine did the work, and she supervised effortlessly. I could not believe it. I kept asking myself how Germany could have fallen so far behind while we thought we were the masters of industrial efficiency.
Near Detroit, prisoners assigned to coal unloading at a power plant were offered another shocking glimpse of American industrial might. Across the River Rouge complex spread out like a city unto itself, employing 100,000 workers in the production of jeeps, aircraft engines, tanks, and other military vehicles. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg could muster. Oberreiter Franz Kellner observed in disbelief the parking lots filled with worker vehicles. Thousands of cars belonging to ordinary laborers, he wrote. In Germany, our officers rarely even owned one vehicle. Here, factory workers drove to work in cars of their own. The guards told us that many workers owned two, one for work, one for family use. At first, we thought they were mocking us. But the numbers were real. The machines were real. The cars were real. The wealth was real. Every day, as the prisoners moved from fields to factories, from harvesters to assembly lines, from small towns to sprawling industrial complexes, the cumulative effect was crushing. The ideological scaffolding that had supported their belief in German superiority and American weakness began to erode. Each observation, each mechanized process, each casual display of wealth and abundance became a lesson in what the Nazis had never understood. A nation's true strength was not measured only in soldiers or tanks, but in infrastructure, productivity, and the everyday prosperity of its people. German POWs were being confronted day by day with the undeniable fact that the industrial and technological power of the United States far exceeded anything their homeland could hope to match. By the onset of winter 1943, the cumulative weight of what the prisoners had witnessed was manifesting in what American intelligence officers had begun to describe as ideological collapse syndrome. Men who had arrived from North Africa as confident soldiers of the Reich, steeped in Nazi doctrine, were now quietly reassessing everything they had been taught. The Special Projects Division, A secret re-education initiative operated under the Provost Marshal General's office meticulously documented these changes. The reports were striking. Increasing numbers of prisoners were requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. They no longer sought merely to occupy their time. They sought knowledge, and with it, comprehension. Major Paul Noland, one of the officers overseeing the monitoring program, noted in a report dated December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when confronted with production statistics or industrial data. They have seen too much with their own eyes. The most fanatical Nazi elements have grown silent. Their loyalty to Germany remains, yet they no longer speak of victory or conquest. They observe, they calculate, and they question everything they were told about America."
Even the prisoners' own newspapers began to reflect this profound psychological transformation. De Roof, the periodical published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, shifted from initial defiant nationalism and propaganda reinforcement toward thoughtful analyses of democracy, economic organization, and the possibilities of post-war reconstruction. Articles on mechanization, worker productivity, and urban planning appeared alongside letters from fellow POWs documenting industrial marvels. The editors, carefully chosen from among anti-Nazi elements within the camp, reported that the readership, once deeply skeptical and hostile, was now increasingly receptive, often reading with a quiet, studious intensity. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censorship, "We were told that America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of sustaining a war effort. Every day here proves the opposite. This is the most organized, productive, and wealthy nation on earth. Factories run continuously. Trains operate without error. And the smallest town has more electricity than an entire district of Berlin. I no longer believe in victory for Germany. The calculations we were taught are wrong. Our entire strategy rests on false assumptions."
Even among the most hardened ideologues, the exposure to American abundance and efficiency had an almost irreversible effect. SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Krüger, captured in Tunisia, had maintained 6 months of complete silence upon arrival, refusing to speak to guards or fellow prisoners, refusing to participate in camp routines, and steadfastly clinging to the ideology of the Reich. But exposure to daily reality slowly eroded that resistance. By February 1944, after several months working in an agricultural processing plant in Iowa, observing vast fields, mechanized harvesters, refrigeration warehouses, and production lines capable of output beyond anything imaginable in Germany, he recorded in his confiscated notebook, "If this is merely their agricultural hinterland, what must their war industry be like? The sheer scale, the precision, the waste, the abundance, everything is beyond our comprehension. We cannot compete. We cannot hope to defeat a nation that possesses such resources, such organization, and such relentless productivity. Every principle we were taught about superiority and inevitability of victory has been shattered."
The impact was more than intellectual. It was deeply emotional. Prisoners, who had once measured bravery and honor by battlefield feats, began to reevaluate the meaning of strength itself. American soldiers and civilians alike, with their unhurried confidence, their material comfort, and the sheer scale of their productivity, demonstrated a power that no blitzkrieg could overcome. The realization that victory in Europe could no longer rest solely on combat prowess, but on infrastructure, abundance, and industrial mastery, took root quietly, insidiously, in the minds of these men. And as the winter deepened, with short days and long nights in the camps, it was not the German officers lecturing on strategy or propaganda that held their attention. It was the evidence they had seen with their own eyes. Fields that could feed thousands in a day. Factories that could produce hundreds of tanks in a month. And towns illuminated and running in ways their homeland had never achieved.
The final blow came with Christmas 1943. Across POW camps scattered throughout the United States, from the rolling plains of Texas to the industrial hubs of the Midwest, German prisoners observed a spectacle that defied every preconception they had carried from Europe. The holiday was celebrated with a generosity and abundance that seemed inconceivable in wartime, a public demonstration of wealth and logistical prowess that left even the most hardened officers in stunned silence. Camp kitchens prepared lavish feasts, roast turkeys stuffed with savory dressing, glazed hams, pies filled with fresh fruit, baskets of apples and oranges, crates of chocolate, and gallons of coffee brewed strong and sweet. Cigarettes were handed freely, not only to American soldiers and officers, but to the prisoners themselves. Red Cross care packages arrived in abundance, each containing chocolates, canned goods, small toys, and handwritten cards from donors far across the country. Choirs sang traditional carols in English, then switched to German, their voices filling the barracks with a sense of warmth, celebration, and security. Guards moved among the prisoners, distributing meals and small gifts, and greeted them with genuine kindness, wishing them Merry Christmas without the smallest trace of mockery or derision.
Gefreiter Karl Schultz, a soldier from Cologne, recorded the day in a letter to his sister. "They gave us chocolate, real chocolate. We had not seen such a thing since 1939. The guards told us it was nothing special, that they gave it to their children all the time. We listened to carols on the radio and slowly understood. Only people absolutely certain of their strength, their victory, and their society treat their enemies this way. They do not fear scarcity. They do not need to be punished. They are confident in their future." His words capture the dawning comprehension among thousands of men that wealth, security, and abundance were themselves instruments of power, capable of demoralizing an enemy without a single shot being fired.
By spring 1944, American intelligence analysts concluded that more than 80% of German POWs had experienced significant ideological weakening. The most resilient resistance remained among hardcore SS personnel, who still clung to Nazi ideology, yet even they had begun to question the assumptions they had once held sacred. Recognizing the profound and tangible effect of exposure to American prosperity, the U.S. government expanded the re-education and acclimatization program, eventually ensuring that 95% of camps nationwide implemented measures designed to encourage contact with American society, industry, and culture. Prisoners were now participating in workshops, libraries, sports, educational lectures, and supervised excursions into nearby towns,
each interaction quietly eroding pre-war propaganda.
When these men were repatriated after the war, they carried more than memories of military defeat. They carried eyewitness testimony of a society whose industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and material abundance exceeded every expectation nurtured under the Third Reich. Historian Werner Gellert would later observe, it was not the battlefield alone that defeated the Wehrmacht. It was the supermarket overflowing with goods, the factories producing at unimaginable scale, the electric lights in every home, the automobiles parked in every driveway, the abundance of meat, bread, and chocolate, and the simple, taken-for-granted luxuries of daily life. Americans defeated Nazi Germany by demonstrating, in the most visceral and undeniable way, a future their soldiers could never hope to build for themselves.
These men had crossed an ocean as soldiers of a so-called master race, indoctrinated to believe in their own superiority. They returned as witnesses to a power and productivity that their homeland could not replicate. The war in Europe might have continued for months or years, but the American victory over Nazi ideology had already been achieved. It was accomplished not through bombs, artillery, or battlefield strategy, but through the quiet, relentless, and inescapable demonstration of abundance, organization, and technological mastery. The prisoners left American soil forever changed, not merely defeated, but enlightened to a reality that would haunt their country and ideology long after the last gun had fallen silent.